All right. For those of you that might be looking at this on the Zoom, I don't have it set up so that you can ask questions, but I think I mentioned in my email what I'm going to do is have the office hours, and you can call me if you have questions on in the office hours, and or you can email me and at any time. And normally I'm in my office more than just the office hours. So anyway, you can just send me an email or whatever and say, hey, I'd like to make sure you're in the office, or you can just call my office at 517-607-2376. Just my regular office. All right. So what we're going to be talking about now, I just wanted to also point out that I put in the How the West Grew Rich subfolder, I have an article on the Hanseatic League that you might want to, if you feel like you want to know a little bit more about it, and if you're entertained by that, you can go ahead and do that. All right. So now we're going to be talking about the institutions that developed in this period, 1450 to 1750. And it's important because if you're going to move from a centrally planned state to an economy of a market system, then what you need to do is you have to realize that certain institutions have to be there in order for the market system to work out. So you don't have to invent them because they're already invented in the West, but you have to have a mechanism to obtain them. So let's go through and look at what some of these institutions were. The first of these institutions was a legal system. So again, these are the institutions that developed in the West in this period, 1450 to 1750. And again, this is chapter 4 in How the West Grew Rich. And the first of these was a legal system to give predictable results. That is, if you sort of think about it, for a market system, we talked about that you have to have some ability to know what's going to be happening, right? Otherwise, if you don't know what the rules of the game are, then you're not likely to go ahead and build a factory, right? Because you don't know whether the government's going to come in and take it away, or if they're going to change the rules of the game, whether you started to build a factory or whatever. So you need a legal system that gives predictable results, and so we know what the rules of the game are, right? It's what Hayek was talking about, the rule of law versus the rule of man, right, in the Constitution of Liberty. And so it turned out that, just an example, enforcing contracts, right? Again, if you take my law and economics class, we have a whole couple chapters in the textbook that in the lectures that deal with contract law. So again, you're going to need some sort of legal system. And why is that, or one of the reasons that market capitalism developed in Britain was that Britain had this idea of common law, which gave it an advantage. That is, you knew what the rules of the game were in Britain more than you did in other places, and so that might be one reason that we saw that it became favored by traders in this period, 1450 to 1750. Why did Britain rise relative to other states? You knew what the rules of the game were if you were going to be involved in trade in Great Britain. Second institution is the development of credit and banking. That is, you didn't have banks in 1200 AD, and you didn't have a way that you could go out and get a loan for 30 years. But if what's going to happen is you're going to buy a bunch of product, and then you're going to put it on a ship, and you're going to send that ship to India, and you're going to sell the product there, and then buy additional product and bring it back, then sell it while you're back to Britain, then you need some mechanism to be able to borrow the money in order to make that happen. So again, using Hayek's idea of social evolution, we would, there was a need for credit and banking once you started getting this international trade going on, or trade in general going on, right? If you have the advancement of trade, then there's a need to develop this idea of credit and banking. And so if you have an ability to charge interest, then you have, and you have enforceable contracts, then it's going to make it so that you have an increased incentive to lend and to, again, you can charge interest. You didn't have some sort of just interest rate. You could charge interest, and you have a contract that's enforceable. What's going to happen? You're going to have incentives to lend, and that's going to lead to a greater ability to trade. And again, there's this idea of social evolution is developing in the West, and if you are going to if you have a country that is not in market capitalism right now, one of the things that you're going to have to do is to have it so that, for example, Bank of America or somebody could open up a banking system in your country. A third thing is insurance markets. Right? You didn't have the idea of insurance in 1300. Monty Python's Holy Grail, they don't have insurance companies. And so if we sort of think about it, insurance companies allow a spreading of the risk, right? If you are going to, again, go through this process of buying product, putting it on a ship, sailing the ship to a foreign port, then again buying product, bringing it back, etc. Well, one of the risks that you have is that people aren't going to pay for the product they don't value the product as much as you thought they were going to, and so you might run a loss. You paid more for the product than you were able to sell it for. But also you have the risk that something's going to happen to the ship, right? And so what the insurance company would do is so people are going to develop this idea of insurance where they say, you know what, you pay us a certain amount and we will pay you if the ship is, something happens to the ship, right? And so again, with insurance companies, you can spread the risk. Again, in my law and economics class, we talk at some length about insurance companies, but the idea is that I can take advantage of the law of large numbers, right? There's some probability that any particular ship is going to get shipwrecked, or a pirate's going to take it, or something like that, and so I can charge a premium that will cover the expected losses from the few ships that are going to end up not making it back. So again, I've got an incentive then I have an incentive to engage in trade because I don't have to take on all that burden of the risk. And I just sort of lead us to the story of Beauty and the Beast, the actual book, or the actual document that was written in around 1740 by a French novelist. And so what happens in that story is that Beauty's father is a merchant, right? And he has these sailing ships, and what happens is he finds out that the ships got shipwrecked. And so he doesn't have money to pay his bills, and so what does he do? They move out to the country. Beauty goes out, he takes his daughters, which would include Beauty, and they move out to this little place in the country, and they're living there. Then a year later, he hears that one of his ships came back, right? It actually managed to make the trip, because they didn't have cell phones in those days, right, to find out what was actually going on. So he goes back from the countryside, goes back to the city, and when he gets there, he finds out that the ship's been sold to pay his debts, right? So he doesn't really have the money. So as he goes back, and he's going back to the country home, what happens? He stumbles across this castle, and what he does is he goes into the castle, and it looks like there's all sorts of food set out for him and the like. And so what he does is he stays there, stays overnight, and then as he's going out, he picks a rose, right? And he's going to take the rose back to Beauty. But what happens is the beast shows up, right? And the beast says, he captures him, and then the beast says, well, you know what? If you will swap with Beauty, I'll let you go. So he goes back to he lets Beauty's father go, goes back to Beauty's to the little country home that they're in. He talks to the daughter, says, hey, don't go back to this castle thing. But Beauty ends up going back and agrees to stay with the beast. And then what happens is they basically they fall in love, and Beauty ends up kissing the beast, and they fall in love, and he turns back into the magic prince, or turns back into the prince that he was. Okay? Now, none of this would have happened if Beauty's father had insurance. So just next time you read the story of Beauty and the Beast, you got to think through what would happen if there'd been insurance in those days. All right. So a fourth institution is dealing with taxation, right? Governments began to have systematic taxation rather than just appropriating. Basically taking your assets away, and expropriating. Appropriating doesn't sound right, right? Expropriating. Rather than just seizing your property, they said, okay, here's what the taxation was. What does that do? That leads to certainty again. Right? And markets need certainty of what the rules of the game are. And so I know that, okay, if there's going to be some certainty about what the rules of the game are. So I know then that, okay, they're going to tax me this much. I can make the decision about whether to engage in this activity. And rather than maybe the government might just come along and seize my property, might seize my shipyard. I'm much less likely to go ahead and build ships if what happens is, I'm much less likely if the government just come along and just seize 2 or 3 of the ships after I've built them. Right? So if I know I have some certainty about what my taxation is going to be, I'm going to be able to have a much more greater incentive to erect buildings, etc. Fifth thing that happened was the institution of property rights. And we've talked much about why it really develops in the West. And we've talked several times about how you need property rights to be well defined in order for market capitalism to work. And so during this period, 1450 to 1750, there began to be, in the West in particular, an emphasis on property rights. How do I know who owns that ship? that I in fact do own that ship. Remember that one of the foundations of liberalism that Mises talked about was not only that you have property rights, but people believe in the property rights. There's that development that happens in this Western, in the West from 1450 to 1750 that Rosenberg and Basel are observing. And once more, we get an observation that's consistent with what the theory is that both Hayek and Mises were talking about. Again, if you look at the Magna Carta, it does in fact talk about property rights. The next thing is the concept of a firm distinct from the individual. The concept of a firm distinct from the individual. And what do we mean by that? That is, okay, there's an idea of something that is an entity that can hire people, it can own property, can engage in economic activity, okay? And when we later on we talk about the rise of the corporation and later on in How the West Grew Rich, but we have this beginning of this idea. We've talked about the East India Trading Company and the Hudson Bay Company. So what does that mean? It means that I can lend to someone, or I can have more confidence that if we have a large project, that I'm not just lending to one individual person, right? I'm lending to this entity that can own property and lasts over time. So what this did was allowed for larger projects, right? This, again, and we've talked about 1450 to 1750 as being the era of trade. These are where the large firms, or the idea of the firm as distinct from an individual, take place at the beginning in aspects of trade. So today, what do we have? We have General Motors, or we have Bank of America as what? As an entity that has rights and can own property and enter into contracts and hire people and everything else, that basically acts as an individual would if this were 1200. But now I know I'm not just lending to Geppetto, right? I'm lending to Geppetto's Geppetto's Clockworks, which is an entity that's going to last longer than Geppetto's lifetime. So if I'm going to do a 30-year loan to Geppetto and he's 63 years old, right? Probably not going to do that. But if I can loan to Geppetto's Clockworks, which is going to be an entity that lasts over time, then I'm more likely to do that. Now, in order for this to make sense, I have to sort of know what the ability of Geppetto's Clockworks is to pay the loan back. So if we sort of think through that, if we're thinking about social evolution again, we have the accounting develops in this period. Right? We develop what we call double entry bookkeeping. If you take an accounting class, right? Basically, you just have what your assets and liabilities are, and what's going on in terms of adding to the assets and adding to the liabilities. So I can look at this. I can look at this information and know, oh yeah, this company's likely to be able to pay me back. Right? It's got assets that are very large relative to what its liabilities are. So if I'm going to be lending to Geppetto's Clockworks, I have to have some reasonable way of knowing, are they likely to pay me back? And so I got to figure out a way that we can do that. So we developed the idea of accounting during this period. Again, you don't have accountants in 1100 AD, right? Because you don't need them. But if we're going to have this system, then we're going to need an idea of how to account for this. All right, so these are the institutions that have developed during this period. Rosenberg and Brazell also make some commentary about what was going on during this period. And in particular, they have a Hayekian statement where they talk about the rising sense of responsibility that is occurring during this period. Right? And we talked about Hayek says in order to have liberty, in order to have markets to work, what do you have to believe? You have to get that you're going to be basically paid the value of your marginal product, right? Or if you are owner of a business, what are you doing? You're making product, and people are willing to pay the opportunity cost of those resources, and the greater the value that you produce over the opportunity cost of those resources, then the wealthier you get. And so he talks about, that Brazell and Rosen talk about a rising sense of responsibility. That occurs during this period, again, 1450 to 1750. And of course, that is, why the West began to have more liberty than the rest of the world, right? You had much more liberty in the West than you did during the feudal era, the feudal era, and so, again, we have a situation where they say that there's a religious and moral attitude that arose. And of course, we talked about that when we were talking about Hayek, that he said it's got to be not just a legal issue, but you have to believe that this is why you are where you are in life. And so it has to be a moral sense of responsibility as well. And of course, again, this theory is, we've talked about, and now we have the Brazell and Rosenberg are observing that during this period in the West, this is what happened. And of course, that's where you eventually ended up with where market capitalism arose. They also point out that we've talked about this before when we were talking about sort of the end of the feudal period, that the merchants began to partner with governments, and so we talked about merchants filling this power vacuum, began to partner with governments to increase the trade. Right, to have rules of the game that began to increase trade. And so what did they do? They granted charters, and the governments granted charters to give you basically a monopoly over the trade. And in return for money. So the one way for governments to gain revenue, again, we talked about how in England, the kings had lost the authority to levy direct taxation without the approval of the parliament. And again, they began to seek out ways to raise trade. And so during this period, 1450 to 1750, this thing expanded even more. Again, you saw the rise of the nation state here, but so individual countries began to have a more centralized source of power. So we did get the rise of the nation state, but Rosenberg and Brazell talk about there's the competition among the nations. What did that do? That limited the ability to regulate and enforce regulations. That is, if they point out is that the the government couldn't intervene in the system as much as it otherwise would, because if they intervened too much, then their economy would not grow as fast as the economy over here. And so that there was if those countries that had less, we talked about earlier about how there was that when the stewards weren't able to enforce all these regulations, and so that was one reason that you had a growth in that economy. Similarly here, countries that a similar comment here is that countries that had less intervention would by their government would have a greater ability to grow and then eventually become more powerful. And again, we talked about that during this period, we talked about how the Chinese, by excluding themselves from trade and still maintaining a very bureaucratic system, fell behind the West during this period. And we've mentioned several times that in the late 1970s, the Chinese began to move towards market capitalism and adopt some of those aspects of market capitalism that expanded liberty. But we've also noted that in the past 20 years or so, there has been a movement towards central planning. And again, we've talked about it'll be an interesting question of how this develops over the next 20 or 30 years. And we've noted that the mechanism by which one moves from a centrally planned state to a market economy, that mechanism by which that movement occurs is not well developed. So just in summary, that one of the lessons to learn from Western economic history is this development of these institutions for a fully developed market system. And again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that these institutions already exist, but they have to be available for, you notice that in China you had the development of all these institutions occurred once we started moving in the late 1970s towards, as they made this movement towards market capitalism. Now, that leads us to the next time period, which is the period 1750 to 1880, and this is the era of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is a time period where the factory system became an important way of producing product. The factory system, we're going from Geppetto's making everything by hand to with Pinocchio to having a factory that's building all the clocks. Okay, so during this period there was one organizational change, right? That was important. And that is this factory system. The organizational change is what? From the artisan craftsman way of producing things to factory production. And there were two technological changes, and again, there's going to be a whole advantage to this organizational change. Let me just focus on that for a second. If you think about how the clocks were made in Pinocchio, Geppetto's making the clock, right? And Geppetto trains Pinocchio or Jiminy Cricket how to produce the clock, right? And they're producing these clocks one at a time, and you know how to build the whole clock when you're doing this. But there is a large advantage for people to have a specialization of labor, right? That is, there's a, and we'll discuss this a little bit more here in a minute, but you get the specialization of labor, and that was one of the things that Adam Smith talks about in Wealth of Nations, is that why is it that, it was called, remember, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Why is it that in Great Britain, they've gotten so wealthy? And he says, right at the beginning of the book, he talks about specialization of labor and why that's an important aspect of it. Also, there's a whole discussion that Adam Smith has about a pin factory, right? He discusses the economic advantage of the pin factory and how much more efficient it is to make pins, and pins were more important in those days, but how more efficient it was to make pins in a factory than it would be to try to make each individual a little artisan learning to make pins, right? And it's very clear from as you're just even thinking about it, how difficult would it be for you to have a little have a little business in Hillsdale where you made the pins there just yourself, right? Just wouldn't make sense, right? There was a large advantage to this organizational change that developed in the West. Again, if you were able to take a look at Adam Smith's book, just go ahead and read that first part in particular where he talks about specialization of labor. But again, it would become obvious that when we talked about, just even if we talked about trade between countries, there's comparative advantage. We also have a comparative advantage just by individuals, right? The opportunity cost of your time when you know how to do this thing becomes much greater to do something else with your time. All right, so the technological improvements that occurred during this phase, right? There was this development in technology. And remember that we said from the period 1450 to 1750, much of the technological change was in trade, as you might expect, because that's where the most economic profit could be made, was by coming up with technological things that advanced trade. So the first of these was the use of steam and water power in factories. You could use steam and water power in factories. In fact, if you ever travel around, walk around Hillsdale, right? You'll see that there's it says F.W. Stock Mills, and it is it's now a company that produces bait for deer, for hunting deer. But what was there for a long period of time was they made flour. In fact, it was the first place, I believe, that they actually produced white flour. But nonetheless, you'll see that where it is where the river goes through, because they used to use the river as a mechanism for generating electricity. So the use of steam and water power in factories, what did that do? Allowed for larger, more powerful equipment, right? So that you could be more productive. Okay? And so again, the steam and water power made it so that you could do that in the factory production. And also the use of steam and water power for transportation. And if you sort of think about it, we'll talk about this in a moment, but I got to move stuff around a lot in if I'm producing things in a factory, and we'll talk more about that when we compare Geppetto's Clockworks with Geppetto himself, just as an individual artisan. But they were basically able to allow for a movement of goods, both inputs into the production system and a movement of the goods out of that system. So the use of steam and water power for both trains, right? You have the steam engine. So you had trains that were developing in this period, and so you have trains and you have steamships and et cetera, allowing you to move things about. The second thing is the use of iron and steel in the making of factory equipment. And so if we sort of think about this, I've got all this machinery and other products that we're using in the factories. If I can use iron and steel, they're going to last a lot longer, and they're going to have the machines will be of greater precision, right? So the machinery, you can make machinery if you're doing it with a steel. You can make it very close in terms of how what the precision of that machine is relative to if it's made out of wood, right? So you have more precision, and you can have larger equipment, and it'll last longer, right? Iron and steel aren't going to wear out in the same way that as a wooden loom might wear out. So what did this do? Increase productivity by a substantial amount. This movement to the factory system, this use of iron and steel in building the machines and maybe building the factory itself, and the use of steam and water power to move stuff around in terms of transportation and to provide power for the factories. And these led to a large increase in productivity. So you have this very large increase in productivity that's appearing in this system. Now, what did that do? That allowed for urbanization. Right? That we talked about urbanization happening in this period 1450 to 1750, but you get this continued urbanization that's happening in the factory system, right? Because we could be more productive and there'd be more economic activity in these urban areas, right? And so what's going to happen? People are going to move from the agricultural areas, you're going to move from the agricultural areas to the cities where the factories are. In addition, if you think about the agricultural productivity is rising in this point too. Right? You drive around Hillsdale during harvesting time. You don't have all sorts of people that are out there, walking through the cornfields picking the ears of corn. What do? You got this big machine that probably, has 6 or 10 rows of corn that it goes through, and it takes and it harvests the corn and puts them into these large bins, and I don't know exactly how it works, but I do have friends that, or one friend he's a farmer, and he harvests corn, right? And so he doesn't get out there and do it by hand. He doesn't hire a bunch of people to do it. He drives this tractor and this machine that goes ahead and harvests the corn. So what did that do? That had two aspects. One is the rising agricultural productivity allowed for, I don't have to have as many people out there on the farm in order to grow the corn. So now the people in the factories can have an increase in agricultural productivity so that we can now have food for all these people. So one is that you have this rising productivity allowed for urbanization, but also you're going to displace agricultural workers. Agricultural workers. Right? I don't need them on the farm anymore. Okay? I'm going to substitute capital or machinery for labor. And so once I'm doing that, what's going to happen? I'm going to, these laborers are going to be displaced. Well, where are they going to go? Well, they went to the factories. So that the factory system also allowed a mechanism for the displaced agricultural workers to find a job. Right? So this displacement that was occurring in agriculture is solved in some sense by this rise of the factories. Right? So again, this sort of social evolution going on that Hayek was talking about. Now, when we looked at the period 1450 to 1750, when we looked at that period, we said that technological change was relatively slow. It was happening, right? It was consistent, but you had technological change was steady but slow. And it had largely to do with transportation. But if we looked at new product, actually new stuff being built, it was mainly for the rich. We said that a lot of the economic growth that's occurring, that is, you're in England, you now have access to silk from India, right? It's not like you're inventing silk, but you now have access to silk that you didn't do before. But it was basically what's going on is you got stuff that's an increase in the availability of product that's coming about from trade. What little increase in the products that if we actually introduced a new product was primarily for the wealthy in this period 1450 to 1750. Now the factory system changed that, right? For the factory system, what did you need? You had products that you can sell a lot of it. And so, that was sort of the point of the factory, right? If I'm only going to make 10 clocks, I don't need, if I'm Geppetto and I'm only making 10 clocks, I don't need a lot of people to be able to buy them. But if we're going to be suddenly making 10,000 clocks, I'm going to make clocks in a way that lots of people can afford to get it. And so in the factory system, really developed products that benefited the poor. And notice that, again, we talked about at the very beginning of the how Brazil and Rosenberger had talked about that it was interesting that that it was an anomaly of Western growth that had benefited the poor more than it did the rich. Okay, and we argued that that's not an anomaly. That is something that we would expect to happen. And so when we think about what's going on in the factory system, if I'm, again, how am I going to get wealthy? I got to find, if I'm going to produce thousands of whatever it is, I got to make it in such a way that lots of people can buy it, right? Otherwise, I don't need the factory. And so, again, the things that could be used by the poor and the lower classes are the products that develop during this period in the Industrial Revolution. Now, when we were talking about demand and supply curves, we talked about this. We could, if we were to draw a picture of what was going on, like Rod Stewart talked about, right? Every picture tells a story. We said that if we thought about it this way, what was going on is we were getting a movement of the supply curve out to the right, right? What was going on? The marginal cost of producing was going down substantially. And so what's going to happen? We're going to get an outward shift of the supply curves. Whether it's for shirts or whether it's for blankets or whatever it is. And so we get this outward shift in that supply curve. And so what's going to happen? We're going to get a decline in prices and we're going to get an increase in the quantity of it. And so what happens then, even the poor began to have access to, in the West, to rudimentary product, right? The poor in the West had access to most rudimentary products, needs. Okay, and so it wasn't an instance of invention of new product, but rather the production of existing product, and that product became much more available. Whereas today, what do you expect to see, right? We've talked about this many times. You expect to see an invention of new product. You expect to see, the 5G network and then the 10G network, and then you expect to see that the iPhone 35 is going to look way different than the iPhone 12, et cetera. Okay, and so if we sort of just, if we're looking at this period, 1750 to 1880, what did we have? We had the existing products became more available. Right, that was what really created the increase in the standard of living. All right, so for Friday, what we'll do is we will again keep moving through the How the West Grew Rich with our goal to be through with that, so that in the last 3 lectures that we have, we will be able to focus on macroeconomics. So you might, if you want, just go ahead and finish reading How the West Grew Rich, but in particular, just look at the finish of this Industrial Revolution and the rise of the corporation, and then we'll quickly talk about the period 1913 to today. We'll quickly go over that because there are really 3 things that happened that were important during that period to see the increase in the size of government. That was one of the focuses that happened from 1913 on. So again, for next time, we will go ahead and we'll pretty much finish the Industrial Revolution part, and then we'll be talking about the rise of the corporation. That is the period 1880 to 1914. So we'll focus on that as a period where the corporation became the entity that that produced much of the product. All right. We'll see you in a couple days.